We have today Mats Persson, director of Open Europe. Open Europe is a think tank based in London, dealing with the discussion about the reform of the European Union. So my first question would be precisely on that reform of agenda. In your view, which are the main fundamental challenge that the European Union is facing right now?
Sure. Well, thanks first of all for having me. It's absolutely fascinating because the challenges that we see in Europe now are basically everywhere. No country is basically spared. In many ways, Spain and Britain have very similar politics all of a sudden, which is absolutely fascinating. But I think for the EU as a whole, there are three main challenges. On the one, first of all, we have this issue about democratic legitimacy. How in the world can we convince voters that the European Union and our policies are worth investing in? Particularly with the rise of a lot of anti-establishment parties on the left and right, still doing incredibly well, still rising, still gaining ground in many different countries, from Helsinki to Madrid now with the rise of Podemos. In particular, in light of all of that, how do we convince voters that the Europe is worth backing in future? So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is, I think, the Eurozone, both in terms of how to fix the euro itself, but also the relationship between the Eurozone and those countries who do not share the single currency. How to reconcile further Eurozone integration with, for example, the single market, which is the property of all 28 member states. And then the final challenge is Europe's overall competitiveness, where in relative terms we're losing out on global trade as share of world GDP, where we clearly have to make sure that we use all the collective instruments we have in Europe to promote growth and jobs. More Europe, if you will, in the area that really matters, which is getting economic growth going again. And of course, we would argue that the best tool we have available is the single market.
And in your opinion, to recover that legitimacy, people are more interested in terms of democracy, in terms of outputs or in terms of input, and how to balance both?
Well, I think it's both. So, of course, ultimately the best way to win voters' trust is to achieve economic growth, to make sure that people have more in their wallets at the end of the month. I mean, that's the ultimate way to gain legitimacy. So if the European Union can show that it creates that kind of growth, then I also think it solves a big part of the legitimacy problem. But that's output, but it's also about input, I think, to some extent. I mean, voters want to feel that they have a say over the decisions that matter to them, whether that is EU rules around working time in Britain, for example, or whether it's EU rules around taxation and spending in Spain, or whether it's about the latest bailout package for taxpayers in Germany. People want to feel that they have a say over these decisions. So it's both input and output.
Open Europe is a London-based think tank, and even if it is independent, is famous for supporting positions which are close to the British government. And it's part of this discussion is the UK membership of the European Union and the prospect for perhaps referendum after some kind of negotiation with the other European Union member state to reform the European Union and to rethink the position of the UK within the European Union. In your view, what are the prospects of the how is the debate right now in the United Kingdom, and which are the prospects after election? It depends very much which party wins election, that we are going to have a coalition government, more pro-European, or UKIP, other Eurosceptic forces within the Conservative Party are more powerful after the election.
Well, the UK at the moment has a very robust internal debate about its place in Europe, but also in the world, actually, I think, to some extent. And that debate will last for some time. And one shouldn't read too much into various headlines coming out of that debate. The big question is what is the reform package that Britain will put on the table at the end of the day if Cameron gets re-elected in 2015, which is a big if. But if he gets re-elected in 2015, then we have an in-that referendum. We have to wait and see what the actual proposed reforms are before we make a judgment. So I think I just want to caution against sort of jumping to conclusions based on speculation in the media at the moment. But certainly, if you look at the basic vision that the UK government has, I think, around a Europe which does less but does it better in certain areas, a Europe which is flexible enough to handle different levels of integration, more integration for the Eurozone, less integration with those countries that want to remain outside, and then a Europe which, as I mentioned, focuses on where it really can boost jobs and growth in the areas of trade in particular. That kind of European Union, I think there's a lot of support for across the EU.
This is my final question, because it is a legitimate position of a country such as United Kingdom that has legitimate views about the future of the European Union, not so ambitious in political trend as other countries which are consider the European integration process and the idea of ever closer union as the national project of those countries. So are you optimistic about to find how to reconcile those different views and have some kind of agreement about that multi-speed Europe?
I think it is, because I think the alternative, a breakup of the EU, which could well be the alternative if we don't find a solution to this, is much worse. I mean, in Spain you have some experience with the challenges of keeping a diverse club together, with regional tensions. I mean, that's very much a similar situation to that which we have in the European Union at the moment. There's a need to kind of reconcile different demands and different political movements across the European Union, and in particular that tension that you referred to, between the kind of the historical demand for more integration in some parts of Europe with a deep felt desire in other parts of Europe for less integration. But I am optimistic about that, because we've dealt with trickier things in the past in the European Union, and I think if you look at Britain, for example, it's in everyone's interest in the rest of the EU to keep Britain in, not least because of geopolitics. I mean, imagine Britain leaving now with all these hotspots around in Europe's neighborhood to have one of, well, arguably two serious military powers in the European Union leave the EU. I think would be quite bad for the rest of Europe. So I think it's in everyone's interest to find a compromise, and a compromise, I might add, which is not only about pandering rather to British demands, but it's also about making the EU as a whole work better. And that's the key. This is not only about Britain, it's about challenges that the EU as a whole face. And for that reason, I think there is a compromise is possible.
Thanks a lot, Mats. It has been a pleasure to have you here today
much.
And discussing about this fascinating moment of the European integration process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.